Thank you. And I think we all are a little surprised by how many people are here at this session. This is really impressive. It really feels like you stuck around, so we better perform for you. So we're already got some ideas. And let me first give you a run of the show. And here, just grab a seat. And let you know how this is going to play out. So the Locknote session is each person up here on the stage is on the review board responsible for helping build the content for the conference you just saw. And so they sit in a unique position where they can see hundreds, I'm not joking, hundreds and hundreds of submissions. And it could be pretty challenging to pick, like, which one are you going to bet on? You want a known, trusted name that's done a lot of good talks in the past, an unknown with really interesting tech, right? There's a lot of trade-offs. And they each are looking at it from a different perspective. Maybe it's AI or hardware. And so we've got some questions here. If you can zoom in, you'll see them. And my plan is to start having a general conversation. I might direct a question at someone. Other people can jump in. Or maybe the questions land flat and they don't have anything to say and we move on. Then, after a certain point, we'll go to questions from the audience. And so we've got microphones set up. It's hard to see with a blaster. In this aisle here and here, I think so we have 3 microphones. So we'll alternate between microphones so everybody gets a chance. When you ask a question, you know, it's not a comment more than a question. No, it's a question. It needs to be a question. And we'll do our best to answer it. All right, so with that said, we're going to kick this thing off. To my left, to your right, Window Snyder from Thistle Technologies. Next to her is Jos Wetzels.
He's at the end.
Oh, wait, where did you go? You're hiding. Nathan Hamiel, then. Kudelski Security. Then Ellen from Google. Ellen.
Cram Kowalczykik.
I am so embarrassed.
Kowalczyk.
Kowalczyk. One of my fears is butchering somebody's name, because that's pretty personal. And then finally, I'm going to butcher your name, Jos Wetzels.
Yes, Jos Wetzels.
Yes. See? So we're going to kick it off. First question. For those who saw the keynote or thoughts about the keynote today, day 2, Moxie, I'll just tell you a little story. I've been trying to get Moxie to speak for about 4 years. He hasn't spoken publicly in 5 years, and I don't know how often he ever plans to speak. So just getting him on stage was like a major victory. And then I thought he was just brilliant in trying to make his points. Maybe it's the word selection. My mom was an English teacher, so I can appreciate the word selection, the construction of the way he organizes thoughts. Great. But I'm curious from the panel here, any thoughts, anything jump out, or is it just well-delivered message for things we'd already kind of internalized as truth? Or what do you think?
Well, I didn't see it, so I'm gonna pass. I had too many sessions. I was running around too much, so I apologize. So
Yeah, I really liked the theme of really helping people understand that, you know, we can have the abstractions, but we really need to understand what's underneath. I see a lot of people enter engineering and, you know, they know the one thing they know, but because they don't know what's going on underneath, they can't reason about how to do something different. And so I thought that was really a cool theme.
Yeah, it's the sort of how many layers of abstraction, right? It's turtles all the way down. And, you know, you don't have to be at the keynote to understand that, but it seems like, is this the new normal? Just more and more abstraction? Or do we reach a threshold where it's like, okay, that's enough abstraction. There's enough black boxes. You've already filled up all the slots. Is that the world we're moving to? Any thoughts? I worry that at some point you reach these completely unknowable systems. There's some talks on cloud, and it's like you're building an infrastructure on a cloud, on a cloud, on a cloud, and at some point you completely lose connection.
We do. We start with students at university and CS programs learning to program using high-level languages and not learning the low-level languages, let alone assembly or computer architecture, which used to be critical for a CS program. And we deploy them into the world as developers, and there's this potential gap. But in a software development environment, it ultimately matters probably not that much, because being able to operate at that higher level of abstraction means that we need fewer developers to do so much more. And the things that we can build today are so much more powerful and so much more complex and so much more, well, dangerous because of this complexity. And nobody really understands, especially for projects that have been going on for years or decades even. You get to a place where your entire development environment, you don't necessarily have that context that you used to have for these projects. And when we start talking about interoperability in the cloud, where everything is built of pieces of everything else, we start to see this entire ecosystem where everything is interconnected and interdependent, where a single failure in one place ends up impacting us in different ways that we might not recognize. Like, I don't know if you guys remember when Dyn fell over, and we had this failure of all these different cloud services. And then coming back up was critical. So, because even if you weren't a customer of Dyn, all the systems that you depended on were a customer of Dyn. So PagerDuty was down. So nobody could get their operations back up because we were all leveraging PagerDuty. And Slack was down. Nobody could have a conversation because we were all using Slack for our operations. This degree of interconnectedness is only increasing. So I don't know how this is going to continue in the future, but we do need to recognize that we're all vulnerable to the same failures in systems that we might not even necessarily recognize that we're using or dependent on.
Did you see any talks maybe that sort of represented this, or is?
I don't think I saw anything that represented this specific issue, but there was a whole lot of talks and a whole lot less of me. But I think I don't think things are getting simpler. I think things are getting far more complex. And, you know, a lot of times what we may be doing, especially with the popularity of AI, is that we're taking things that were previously done in a more deterministic fashion and making them more probabilistic. So we may be redefining functions and applications that, you know, are not as reliable, for lack of a better term. So it might not even be leading to vulnerabilities. It may just be leading to inconsistencies and problems in software. So there was some vulnerability recently which is my new favorite thing, like whenever anybody finds an issue with an AI product that leads in remote code execution, they're like, well, you shouldn't be running it like that. You should put it in a container, which is not the proper way to fix something. And when you kind of dig into the code, it's because they will call something like maybe Plotly to do a diagram or something, and instead of writing the Plotly code, which isn't hard to do, they use an LLM to automatically generate new code and then execute that new code, which hopefully everybody in here knows is a very bad time when any attacker can get any kind of data into that. So I think what we're doing, at least in the short term, is making things far more complex. And that's beyond, you know, supply chain issues. Even if you're using something like a code generation tool, it could be making recommendations that cause dependency bloat. And now you have increased your dependencies instead of reducing them, which you should, which would lead to a lower attack surface. So I think those are things that are going to continue.
The quiet ones.
Yeah, I don't really have an opinion.
Okay. So you're basically talking maybe a little bit, you know, complex systems fail in unpredictable ways, and so we have to be okay with failure, and we have to be okay with never being able to fully describe to management why it failed, right? Because if it's not deterministic and it's probabilistic, you've got to get management on board that's like, yeah, and one day it'll fail, and I won't be able to tell you why, and you're going to have to be okay with that. Like, do you think management really understands that yet?
No, I don't think they understand when things are reliable either, in many cases. But I think it's okay for things to fail as long as it's all use case dependent. So as long as the cost of failure is relatively low, failures are annoyances. But as your use case becomes more important, the cost of failure actually impacts lives, livelihoods, financial impacts, and those types of things. And one of the things that's happening now is people want to deploy AI in everything, and not realizing that some of these use cases, right, have a low tolerance for failures. And I think that's going to continue to happen until we have some more major problems, or until people realize that, hey, this wasn't the right tool for the right job for this particular use case.
Well, we could practice failure. We could become more resilient against failure if we practiced failing. What happens if this service goes down? What happens if this server is down? What if we run an exercise where the East Coast data center is down and everything has to move over to the West Coast? Or we practice rolling our keys, or practice restoring from backup. We're not necessarily doing the work we need to do in order to fail and recover gracefully. We are going to have failures. We're going to have more and more failures as things become more complex. And we can become more resilient, more resistant to these failures if we practiced failing.
Sorry, I was previously at a company, and they were buying services from a third party that was buying services from Amazon, blocks services this buying. And I remember talking to them, and I'm saying, okay, so if you have an outage, you'll notify us. Yes, if we have an outage, we'll let you know. Okay, if one of your third parties has an outage, will you notify us? It's like, well, we don't know if our third parties will notify us. It's like, well, you've got the contract, you talk to them. And then at the end of it all, we're like, okay, we think we understand it, it's great, you'll notify us. Not 2 months later, there's an outage. And it's Amazon Block Services. And we're like, hey, how'd that notifying us thing go? And they're like, we didn't even know we were dependent on Amazon Block Services. We only thought we were dependent on this other thing. It's like sometimes your vendors don't even know.
That goes as for the software they're developing as well, that you don't necessarily know what libraries are present in these systems that you're using. When there's a vulnerability that is present in maybe an open source library that you've incorporated into your project, you might not know it's there because what you actually incorporated was a different library that incorporated it, and it's not on your radar that this is something that's going to impact you. So even being able to identify what's present in your development environment is an exercise that you want to do before you're actually trying to figure out, does this specific vulnerability in this library that we may or may not have incorporated impact us?
Well, and you might be dependent on block services, but you might not know, like, where's the storage, what region, who's holding it. Like, I think maybe you were mentioning earlier about where's the data.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm the AI.
Wait, I was making eyeballs.
Down here.
Yeah. One of the talks I actually really enjoyed was one where they talked about the fact that when you spin up a cloud service, in many cases, it is spinning up, a bunch of other resources under the hood, and really understanding, what is it doing on your behalf. In some ways, it's that same sort of, theme of abstraction away. You're getting this whole package of things, not just the thing at the top, and you're depending on the people who wrote the service to know what they are doing and configuring the next layer and the next layer and the next layer, as well as fixing any vulns or anything else like that. And so much like the abstraction is a problem overall, I think there is definitely an abstraction where we're starting to see people look around more, not just at the top surface, but like really dig into, what assumptions might have been made when building the software, and how can those be exploited?
Well, I would think in AI, if it was all built, it emerged so rapidly into the commercial realm that it was probably all built for laboratories by scientists, right?
Yeah.
The big open flat networks, everybody trusts everything, and it's just trying to get a result. And next thing you know, they want to take your result and put it on, the stock market, and it's not ready for that.
Correct. Yeah. So I lead the AI track for Black Hat, and one of the things that I'm actually seeing is this, we're kind of we've learned a lot in security over the decades, right? So every single time one of these new technologies comes along, we throw the rule book out and say, this is so different, we need to start from scratch. We've learned a lot of these lessons. So we've learned we shouldn't just take trusted, untrusted data, sensitive and non-sensitive data, and throw them all together and hope that good things happen, because we know that bad things will happen. So we need to start going back to basics and saying, okay, what are we actually doing here? How do we apply what we already know to these current technologies? And when we apply what we already know, like we kind of know authentication is important and authorization is important. So how far does that really get us? And then what is the gap from there? Are these really gaps? Or can we take even more of what we know or take something from a different domain and apply it? So I think a lot of lessons learned can already be applied, and that's something that's not happening nearly enough.
But I think something you also see is that people, even if they know what they have to apply, they don't know how to apply it. I think the talk on the Siemens S7 PLCs was a good example of that, where you see a vendor, one of the few vendors actually willing to add security mechanisms at a device level in OT, consistently not being able to get it right and getting it wrong again and again and again, which is why this subject has been covered multiple times at Black Hat. And you see people, they know how to do device level authentication. This is not an unsolved problem, but they're still not able to get it right. And for some reason, this persists in this space where people will implement well-known security controls in the wrong kind of ways. So apparently, for some reason, there's not enough clear guidance on this.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, for the devices, for systems where we know what to do, and we've been doing it all along, we don't recognize it when it's present in another very similar system. So one of the things I saw in the devices track was that even if you have like a very resilient operating system, it might be sitting on top of a system where the firmware doesn't have the same kind of security investment that we've seen for the general purpose operating system. And so now you're looking at problems that, for the most part, these general purpose operating systems have addressed, decades ago, are still present and vulnerable and undermining the huge security investment that's gone into the operating system and compromising the entire system through these low-level components. And if not, the firmware, let's say on the chip, maybe the firmware on one of the other chips that are attached to the same system, that one of the many 20-plus components that have writable firmware on these systems. So I saw that in the UEFI talk earlier today, and it feels like it's a theme that just keeps coming back up, that the weakest link is always going to be where the attacker goes, and here's a space where we've got really quite robust computers and significant tech stacks that are just not getting the same degree of security investment, even though, as an industry, we already know what we need to do in these spaces.
So also, Window, you mentioned earlier, I think, a little bit about if each layer is sort of trusting the layer below it, kind of implicitly, right? It's all built up. I wanted to get the conversation we have started about agents and endpoints, and how you were saying that the AI, the desire to hoover up the information, right?
We have this great desire to enable these AI agents to advise us or act on our behalf. And then we take a system maybe running on a workstation and give it access to your email and your calendar and the web browser, allow it to take data in from the web and make decisions and execute that in all these different places where we've built over the years pretty significant security boundaries, but throw it all out the window so that the AI agent can act on your behalf and schedule appointments for you and shoot off an email. And it reminds me that we've learned this lesson over and over again, but recently, in the web browser, where once upon a time we had a single process. We don't do that anymore, but we used to have a single process for the web browser. And then we give the web browser access to everything that the user thought was important, from passwords to credit card numbers to their browser history. And then in that same system, go out and grab code from all these different websites and execute it in the same process. And then of course that unites all these different security spaces that should be highly compartmentalized, and of course creates all kinds of problems. We're doing it again, like we haven't learned our lessons. We're doing it again with these agents and these AI clients, where we want to connect it to all of our systems for on the consumer side for email and for calendaring and you name it. But then in the infrastructure side for managing systems that we've created, access control for, and all these different procedures where we've decided to unite it again and unite it and traverse all these security boundaries and undermine all this security resilience work that we've built in place for the questionable benefit of letting the AI make decisions about applying rules or analyzing configurations. I do find this to be very concerning.
Especially since, email is one place where you definitely know you have untrusted data. Like, I mean, you know, we're ingesting this untrusted data, putting it into a quote-unquote safe environment and hoping that things go well.
Well, I mean, how do you buy a TLS certificate? You authenticate it through email. How do you password recover? Through email. I mean, you get email, you get everything.
Yep.
It's pretty crazy.
Yep.
OK, so what you were saying, though, also reminds me about this trend toward wanting the technology to do it for you, which is fine. Like, you want the technology in the self-driving car to drive the car, right? Make decisions for you. But that's maybe a more constrained problem set than trying to get your AI to bargain for the best price online for you or something. And so I'm super curious to see how this turns out, especially we haven't even talked about adversaries.
Yes.
This is just trying to get this stuff to work as intended. OK, so let's shift a little bit. I want to ask Jos a question. Hardware.
Yeah.
Attacks.
Yeah, so
What are you seeing?
So one of the things I noticed during this conference is that there were several talks where you saw that the equipment used to carry out these particular hardware attacks, whether they were laser injections or EM measurements, they've gotten a lot cheaper. Like previously, you had to spend tens of thousands of dollars or even more to build up a hardware lab capable of doing these kind of attacks, which kind of limited the attacker space to either nation-state adversaries or very advanced labs. And these days, these kind of attacks have become accessible to basically a student's budget. And this is something that you've seen increasingly and that you've also previously seen in the world of radio frequency attacks. So a few decades ago, with the introduction of SDR, you saw that the kind of attacks that previously were only accessible to SIGINT agencies have now become accessible to
Right, this would be like the proximity card attacks on HID access control systems or whatever, car unlock.
Anything, any kind of radio frequency network these days is fair game for someone with the right kind of knowledge because you don't need this expensive equipment. You don't even really need deep RF knowledge anymore to carry out these kind of attacks. And the same kind of thing with the productization of these hardware level attacks is something you're seeing in recent years, which I think will kind of mean that a lot of these vendors will have to raise the bar on the security of their products.
OK, so from your perspective, what just got cheaper here? The laser attack, which means what?
What was that?
The laser attack just got cheaper.
Yeah.
What is the laser attack?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at several of the talks, there were several ones that focused on various kinds of invasive or non-invasive hardware attacks, where you're able to essentially manipulate the contents of a product.
Not just look at, you could change it. You could flip a bit.
Yeah.
Oh, OK.
So basically what that means in practice for vendors of chips means that they will need to start considering this within the threat model, whereas previously they could have considered it out of scope because it's only limited to these kind of nations.
Do you know of any solutions? Do you just have to buy the laser-resistant chip now?
Well, I mean, there's chips that are far more resistant against these kind of invasive attacks, and I think these more high-end chips and the measures that they are taking will need to be considered for a different space of the silicon manufacturing spectrum.
And so this is more of a personal curiosity. So what's left?
So what's left?
What's left? I mean, OK, RF came down. Laser came down. I think this EMI fault injection has come down. There's maybe some ultrasonic one. Like, there's some glitching, power glitching. Like, what has not entered the consumer range yet?
I think what's usually left is the accuracy of this kind of tooling and the range of coverage. Because if you look at a lot of the more accessible equipment, they're not always capable of dealing with, let's say, high-end application processors with the kind of level of accuracy that this more advanced tooling is capable of covering. So being able to broaden the scope of the kind of chips that you can attack, having a higher degree of accuracy, that would really change the playing field there, rather than attacking these smaller microcontrollers.
Super fascinating. I always thought that if we were ever going to be able to rebel against our robotic overlords, we're going to need to know this stuff. So I'm glad that it's coming out. Doesn't require like a Skynet lab. Okay, so we've got 15 minutes left. I'm curious, I have maybe one more topic I want to explore, and then we're going to go to questions, because I think we'll probably have a good time with questions, because there's a lot of people here. Okay, so, well, I've got two. I've got, maybe we'll have a show of hands. I've got hearing reflections on the quantity and quality of submissions, like what's out there, what's happening in the space. Or maybe we talk a little bit about quantum. So who wants to hear about quantum? Who wants to hear about what kind of submissions are out there and how things are going? You guys, you. Okay, well, how about we just speed it up on both? First, quick, what do you think happened?
Was that what happened?
Yeah, you didn't I was overclocking.
You didn't teleport it to me, so
I did not quantum superposition mine.
You shot it faster than the speed of light, and I couldn't take it.
So yeah, so submission quality. I think we saw more foreigners.
I think we saw a lot more quality this year. I was really impressed. Many more submissions with full-out white papers. A lot more lists of CVEs than I've seen for the last few years. It felt very much like kind of classic Black Hat, and that was a lot of fun. But just overall, like I noticed that even the submissions that didn't make it seemed like they were more polished, more well thought out. There was a lot more research out there that we couldn't include. And that's always really exciting to see how much really good stuff is happening out there.
Now, do you think is quality improved because of AI?
I doubt it. It wasn't necessarily the writing that was better, it was the ideas.
How many talks were generated by AI?
There was actually quite a few. And on the AI track, so...
you'd be the prime target to get.
Right.
Yeah, I have to watch what I say here, because I don't want to disclose anything, but somebody submitted, I can't remember if it was this year or last year, somebody submitted a talk on detecting AI-generated text. And I used their tool and fed their submission into it, and it said it was 100% AI generated. So probably not a good submission. And you know what, like for me, even not everybody has English as a first language. Sometimes writing this stuff is a little, I go back and forth about what, I mean, I don't necessarily ding anybody on a submission. I don't know if anybody else does either. So it's not something, it's more about, does it say what you're thinking, and is it saying anything stupid? Because it's a really bad time to not catch that in the submission.
Do any of you have sort of tripwires? Like if they say, quote, and for fun and profit, you're like, nope, doesn't matter. Like there's too many of those submissions, right? Like are there certain things you read and you're like, no.
I mean, there's the classic one, which is, we're always looking out to make sure that people aren't turning this into a sales opportunity. People come to this conference, or come to these talks for the research, for learning something new. There's a whole show floor for advertising out there, and so we definitely, take a very close eye on, is this really actual research that's being shared with the community, or is this, something with a sales agenda? We actually added a question this year about whether or not the company you work for sells a product in the space. And that, I found that really, really helpful for us to be able to kind of sort out people who, maybe even just didn't understand that, this is not a place for you to, hawk your wares. This is a place for you to come with your research.
Yeah, I think for me, like after reviewing for so many years, you kind of get a sense very early on whether people are onto something or off of something. So for me, it's not any particular phrase, because even a few years ago, people didn't like the word cyber. So it's like, oh, you put cyber in your title or you put cyber in your abstract, and that's not good. But I think it's more about, do you get like a cringeworthy feeling when you start reading through this, or is somebody kind of making claims up? And I think with all the hype in the AI space, one of the things that's been very interesting is looking at the submissions in the track. So you'll see all of the claims, all of the people posting on Twitter, all of the people trying to become AI influencers talking about all these things. But when you submit something to Black Hat, you actually have to have something. You have to prove something. So a lot of times I'll ask people in the submission, how are you quantifying your results? Like, what is your benchmarking criteria? Is it you did this? Is it any better than how you were doing it before? Those are the types of questions that people are going to have when they review the submission. And some people are really good at that, and some people forget, and some people are just making things up. So you kind of get a feel for that when you read it.
Yeah, I think in general, for me, it's just the general signal to noise ratio. If it takes you a very long time to get to the technical meat of things, then it's probably a lot of fluff, especially if there's, words like cutting edge, bleeding edge, next generation in there. Then, you have to have something really good to make up for using those words. And secondly, if it's missing, either a white paper or a slide deck to really back up the claims that you make in an abstract, then that kind of sets you back a little, in my opinion. You need something to show already when you're making the submission. That's what, in my opinion, makes a really strong submission.
That's like the opposite of the reason you submit at a security conference, so you can put your slides together 5 minutes before you walk on stage. So
yeah,
it can be a problem.
Personally, I don't mind if there aren't full slides, but I do want to see that you have thought through, like, how are you going to talk about your content? You can have an amazing idea, but if you can't figure out how you're going to frame it in a way that the audience is actually going to understand it, then it's not going to go over as well as we'd like.
For me, I've had a much more emotional response to these, where I was like, I really want to see this talk. I'm excited about this topic. I think what they're doing is interesting, and I want to be in the audience. I want to see this talk. And for this question of whether they've got something to sell, I'm a little bit, let's say, less put off by this, because I imagine that if this is an area of interest for you, if this is something that you're doing research in, that you're also working on it in your professional life is not so hard to imagine. So trying to look for a sales pitch at the same time recognizing that we might be doing research and working on these things because we're just really passionate about it, and that's not so hard to imagine.
I always look for, do they provide references? Like, do they acknowledge the work of other people, or did this just spontaneously construct in your brain without the help? You stood on no shoulders of giants. It was just all you, right?
I think that's a difference between Black Hat and security conferences in general being like more applied and less academic. Because the academics who submit to Black Hat are very good about references and very good about listing every single author in the speaker column. So there's like 12 or 13 speakers when only 1 or 2 shows up. So I think it's a little bit of a disconnect between academia and the applied world.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to Q&A. If anybody has a question, now's your time to go to the microphone. If you don't have questions, we will keep talking. Let's see if this gentleman just keeps walking past the microphone, or if
Yeah, well.
yes,
Hey.
first contestant.
Good evening. Thank you. I found it very interesting this morning's keynote and what you were talking about technology abstraction layers getting more and more complex while losing focus on the lower ones, like talking about learning high-level languages and never learning assembly or anything like that. I'm starting to see many companies have the same thing happen when it comes to security, meaning that they have XDR, MFA, and AI-driven network visibility, but they lose track of the lower levels of things like patching, BIOS, and keeping track of software versions, thinking that these more advanced layers are keeping them safe. I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts or have noticed any of those happening.
Yeah, there's no product you can buy on the vendor floor that's going to fix it for you. The things that really contribute to security resilience in your environment and in your application are the same sorts of things that have always been able to provide a meaningful, measurable improvement in security. And those are things like compartmentalization and reducing the capabilities that you don't need. So getting rid of old code or old services, or developing resilience so you can fail over into an acceptable state gracefully. Those kinds of there might be products that support those kinds of efforts, but those kinds of environments that rely on these kinds of high-level tools are not necessarily going to get the benefit out of them they would if they had made the investment in these kinds of capabilities, reducing privilege to the appropriate set of individuals who need to have access to that system. That kind of work is very difficult to replace with a product.
I'm curious, by show of hands, who, your company or wherever, who has done like a contingency, disaster, anything exercise in the last 6 months? Oh, that's more than I thought. I would say exercise.
Hope.
Yeah, I would say exercise, like none of these tools are going to automatically exercise your playbook for you. So even if you buy all the products, you still need to exercise. This gentleman?
Yeah, when you're talking about the layers of abstraction, I think there's a dichotomy there between separation of duties and like least privilege. And with like developing code, you have people who develop different portions of the code, and then when something goes wrong, you don't necessarily have one person that can figure out what went wrong. You have to go to each individual parties who develop different portions of the code. And I see that kind of being the trend, moving into the future is you don't have one person who knows kind of everything because they're so hyper specialized into their own little aspects. So I guess what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think some of this is going to depend on how good, AI coding assistants get. So, because talking about people who don't know what the code does, what we're seeing today in that space, at least with complexity and developer knowledge and everything, is the best case scenario is that these tools basically get better at coding, and then the developers themselves have to write more tests to test the code. So some combination of that may actually be beneficial. So if you don't have mature tests today, like having code that actually does good tests could help identify failure, at least from a software perspective, not taking all the other layers into account. I mean, could help you identify problems before they happen. So there's some hope there. Anything to add?
Yeah, we've seen abstraction really support our security objectives, moving away from these lower level languages into these higher level languages where memory management is abstracted away from the developer means that we have less opportunity for memory corruption issues. We have less opportunity for memory leaks. It's more stable. So abstraction can support a lot of the work that we're trying to do. So I think the same thing can happen with these AI agents, but it's not necessarily where we are today in terms of AI-generated code. But in the future, we might get to a place where it supports developers from not making the same kinds of mistakes that we've made over the years by generating code that's designed to be more resilient. I hope. I haven't seen it yet, but like it could happen.
Yeah, I'd say also, I mean, I really want to encourage curiosity on the teams that I work with. Like, you should actually wonder, how does the component that call you actually work, at least somewhat? What would you do if you got something from it that you weren't expecting? And so I think, hopefully we could also encourage people not to just be like heads down on their little chunk and really thinking about the system wider and, continuing that curiosity and that learning about like understanding the things around you. So we do have a better way to be able to, work together to figure out what's going wrong.
Yeah, and to a certain degree, I think automation will be called for, because this is not just a problem for code, this is a problem for networks, for control systems, for anything beyond that, where the sheer scale and diversity of systems, especially as they grow and evolve over time, being acquired by a different company, then getting other components pulled in, cannot be understood not just by a single person, but often not anymore by an entire team. And for many of these sub-problems, you will need some sort of automation solution to be able to help you map out these systems of systems, because it's simply not humanly possible anymore at a certain point.
Yeah, the keynote mentioned the folly of trying to train the general public to be like us and understand everything, but the layers of abstraction that we're encountering are kind of nothing compared to the layers of abstraction that our kids are encountering in their everyday lives and everyone else. So where do you think the general public should be at as far as education or even just understanding the systems they're interacting with every day? Or do you think there should be some kind of basic education in that, and what would that consist of?
I would love for the general public to be able to understand how these systems work, but I think they need to work properly and safely, even if they don't understand them. And I think that's on us as the developers of technology, on us as technicians, that clicking on the link should not be a dangerous prospect. You should be able to click on the link and not have it compromise your entire system or your entire enterprise, right? If you get an email that convinces you that you need to go do something, the problem is that we've put trust in these systems that are incredibly difficult to validate, like where this email actually came from, for an average user. So I think that it would be fantastic if the general public understood these systems, but I think it would be more realistic, more practical, to create systems that don't require the kind of knowledge that's present in this room in order to be able to operate these systems safely.
Yeah, I think that the user shouldn't need to know the complexity of the system in order to use it properly. Far too often, we do not focus on safe to use criteria. So focusing on making a product safe to use includes security, it includes privacy, it includes reliability, and all of these different things. And I think that that should be our job, our goal is to ensure that the products that are being built are safe.
It's the death of encrypted email. You had to be literally an expert to use PGP.
Yes.
Like, so nobody used PGP, and we're the experts in the room, right?
Yeah.
And then S-MIME was going to be the solution, trust on first use. It's like, I dare you to roll a key with S-MIME. You can't roll the key. You're doomed, right? It works until your key expires, and then you really are in trouble. And my mom should not have to understand how the anti-lock brake system works to operate the car, right? And we seem to make this exception that, well, software is different. Everything else in our entire life that our kids learn, all of these sort of risks, reward trade-off decisions they learn, it should work everywhere else except in this one area. And like, that doesn't seem right.
I have to admit, this is one of the reasons why Moxley's work has been so interesting. I mean, I use Signal, but so does my kids, so do my friends who are not in tech. Like, it is so easy to use that it can be used universally, and I think that's going to be super important is, for us to take the complexity away and make it so that these things are easily used by everyone. Without that, with all of the things you'd otherwise have to understand, you're only ever going to get the people who want to specialize in an area. And so, yeah, I fully agree that it is our responsibility to make sure that things are safe to use.
Okay, so we are over time, but I feel a little guilty because I'm not sure which of you two were standing the longest.
That corner left.
Oh, that corner left. Oh, okay. Wait, there's more microphones back there? I'm sorry, sir. I didn't even realize. You're next.
Okay. So I've been really impressed by the variety of topics and in the papers, and also how they're sort of balanced. They're not all about one topic. So I'm curious, did the reviewers have some sort of horse trading where you guys figure out, like, you won't have too many papers about blockchain?
Web3. Did you want more Web3?
Yeah, so I think well, we have individual tracks and individual track leads, and security people are typically not very opinionated, so you don't normally have that type of thing. There was a little bit of, if you notice, there was a little more AI this year. It has to do with the fact that the track really received twice as many submissions as any other track. So I think there was some shuffling, and not everybody was happy about it, but I'm glad to hear that it worked out and that it was. So we always, it does kind of come down to like the final selections where there's no more tracks and it kind of all goes into a pool. And we have a review board fight club, and we duke it out until the blockchain talks win.
All right, well, that's it. We're out of time. Some of us will be up here hanging out, talking with you. And other than that, I'm glad you stayed for the very end of Black Hat, and thank you so much for attending. It's been really wonderful.
Thanks.